Hey folks, Roland Martin here. Welcome to my YouTube channel. You know, about 30 years ago, I decided to write a book. There was a book called Roland Martin's 101 Bass Catching Secrets. And it was all about different patterns and stuff. And I've talked about patterns a lot of times. But there's one part of this book that I really is really fond to me because it's a great thing to talk about. And that is the reasons why bass bite in the first place. And I had just kind of made definitive statements on 9 reasons. There's 9 particular reasons and ways to catch fish because why they bite in the first place. Now, the most, let's just talk about the book just for a second. This book was published by Winchester Press back in the 80s, and it was the second most successful book they ever published. And I asked the publisher one day at Winchester Press, they said, well, what's the first most successful book? They said, well, it was a book on bird watching. So evidently there's a lot of bird watchers out there, we don't know it. But this book sold a couple 100,000 copies. It's not available right now, and I'm trying to get it maybe reestablished, but you can still find them on eBay and online and used bookstores. The book's still available. It's been really popular. But the thing about a book, and what's the secret of a book, you notice pretty much every page that I got a picture on every page or an illustration of some sort. That was kind of my goal, to get a picture or an illustration or some kind of thing on each and every page. People look at that first. And if that's interesting, then they go ahead and read the script. But in this case, I want to talk about the 9 reasons why bass bite in the first place and how that relates to how to catch fish. Okay, the first thing that's obvious is they're hungry. They're feeding. And you know, in the percentages of things, if you were just talking about the early morning hours and maybe a feeding period in the middle of the day for half an hour, and then again that little bit of feed in the afternoon or the evening, it's only about 25% of the time, at best, not even 25% of the time, would you find feeding fish. Because in your tournament format, for example, you'd get out early in the morning, you'd get that bite, and then maybe there's a major feeding period, a cylinder period or something that comes along through the day, and you get that bite a few percent of the time, but you're not going to be able to fish. The tournaments don't last through the evening, so you're not going to get that bite. So you're not going to get 100% of your fish being caught feeding. You're only going to get a few of them. So how I'll make that work is that I try to establish a pattern. Now, a pattern, just real quick, is that exact set of water and cover conditions that attract fish to that particular spot and other similar spots all around the lake. Now, when it's exact set of water and cover conditions, that's the water depth, the water clarity, the water temperature, the cover in the water, the depth, the structure, all those kind of things are water conditions. So it's that exact set of water conditions that attract fish to that spot. So it means that if I go to a stumpy point first thing in the morning, and I throw by a sump, a nice little isolated sump, and I throw in there with a little topwater plug, boom, I catch a bass. Well, now that could be a pattern. Okay, so what I do is I'd go over to that stump. Now here's the difference, I just don't look at it. I go over to the stump and I feel the bottom with my rod tip and see if it's a mud bottom, clay bottom, sand bottom. I look around the stump, are there any weeds? Is it clear water? Is it dingy water? I take my rod and stick it down, it's exactly the depth, okay. I look at my thermometer, my water temperature gauge. Sure enough, it's a certain temperature, okay. If I can duplicate that with the way the sun blows and the way the wind's blowing and the way everything is set up on that particular stump, if I can find another one just like it, with all the conditions just the same, the wind conditions, the water conditions, perfectly the same, I could catch another fish. It could be the pattern. It could be the pattern. Might not be, but that's at least where I'm coming from. Okay, so what I'd start to do is I always think that in a tournament day or any kind of day, there's always an early morning bite pattern. There's usually a dock pattern. There's usually a lily pad pattern. There's usually a brush pile pattern. There's usually a deep structure pattern. There's 4, 5, 6 patterns that I can find in a day. That's usually the case. So I'm trying to find one to start with. Okay. I've gone to that point, I've thrown to that stump, I've caught a bass. Sure enough, I go around I look at my contour map, and I look at the GPS map and say, okay, here's another cove just like it. Wind's blowing in the same way, same kind of depth, same kind of everything. Maybe we get a fish, maybe we won't. Think about the isolated stump in the first place. It might be that it's just an isolated stump. I go to the next point, there's 10 stumps there. Maybe there's only one bass, but he's on one of the 10 stumps. Whereas on that isolated point, where the isolated stump, there was one bass on one stump. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about too, is isolated cover, for example, versus a lot of cover. Well, anyway, I try to establish something early like that, and usually I get a topwater bite going with a buzzbait, with a devil horse, with a Zara spook, with something like that. And then as the day gets up, maybe a little wind starts to blow, I can kind of rework that pattern. I'm thinking, well, the points are number one, the best places to ever go. You can start off on a point in the mornings. That's number one pattern spot that I've ever found, is a point. So I'm looking for a lot of points. And as the sun gets up a little bit, I might change from a topwater to, say, a chatterbait or a spinnerbait, for example, or a shallow water, a little rattle trap, or some kind of small little square bill. Again, I'm working out a little bit deeper on that point. I'm still not thinking about deep water. I'm still thinking about shallow water. So I wear, polarized glasses, and I'm always looking for that stump. I'm looking for that grass. I'm looking for underwater cover. I'm looking for an ambush point. So I'm thinking about ambush points all the time. And when I find that ambush point, I'm thinking about 2 or 3 things. I'm thinking about how the sun is, because they have non-eyelated eyes. And if there's a stump there, he's going to be in the shade. And he's going to be facing the current, because they can't swim backwards. Bass can't swim. They just don't swim backwards. They always face the current. So if the wind's blowing, it's usually in the shallow water causing a little current. They're usually facing the wind, and they're in the shade of that stump. So now I can place the fish. I can just look at that stump and say, well, he ought to be kind of right over there. Now that's a big advantage, because now I remember one time I was bone fishing down in the Florida Keys, and this guy Bill Schmidt was a bonefish guide, and he told me all about it. He says, Roland, you're some kind of hotshot fisherman. I just want to tell you one thing. Whatever you do when you're throwing on these bonefish, don't throw on their tail. It's the worst thing you can do. You'll scare them every single time. I don't care if it's a barracuda, a tarpon, a shark, a bonefish, whatever you throw on their tail, they'll spook. And that's the same with bass. I didn't realize it was the same with bass, but I'd seen a lot of times I'd make a cast and I'd see a wake leaf because I threw on its tail. But by thinking about the conditions there, by thinking about the wind and how that directs them, and also thinking about the sun and how they seek the shade, you can kind of figure out where they'll be. Now you got them located, and now you won't throw in their tail. You can throw in front of them. Okay, that's a really, really big consideration. Okay, the next thing I'd do is, as the day progresses, I'm going to kind of get off those points. I've fished the points now a couple hours now, and I've caught a couple fish. I'm thinking about things like boat docks. I'm thinking about something like a log. I'm thinking about overhang bushes. I'm thinking about lily pads. I'm thinking about something that offers some shade and protection and overhead cover. So that's another pattern. It might be a boat dock pattern. It might be a lily pad pattern. It might be just, in the case of a lot of these reservoirs, when the water first comes up, a lot of times there's floating logs and debris in the back of the cove from the spring rains. That could be a pattern. There's any number of patterns like that are still shallow water patterns where you're thinking about the sun and you're thinking about the wind, and again you're thinking about water clarity and water temperatures. All these are things that you're trying to duplicate. Once you find a fish, you want to duplicate all those conditions. Okay, so I'm establishing a pattern, but I'm still talking about why they bite in the first place. The reason why they bit was that they're hungry. Okay, we're dealing with a hungry fish. So now let's go to the second reason why they bite. Okay, the second and most important reason of all is right here in the book, is reflex action. Now, reflex action, it's kind of like a cat. If the cat's laying there and you throw a ball in front of the cat, reflexively, a lot of times they'll just grab at the ball. It's just a reflex. And it's the same thing with the bass. If you isolate the bass and you figure he's right by that stump and he's in the shade and he's facing this way, and you've done all that, and you take that spinnerbait, or you take that chatterbait, or you take that whatever it is that you're throwing and throw it right in front of his face, boom, a reflex action strike. I get like 45% or 50% of all the bass I catch in a single day off of reflex action strikes. That's particularly when I'm fishing an ambush point. That's particularly when I'm fishing shallow water. And that's particularly when I can see those stumps and those logs and those rocks. And I can kind of visualize where those bass might be. And I'm making little casts right in front of the spot where the fish ought to be. When I figure where they ought to be, and I make that cast, I get a reflex action strike. And that's sometimes the winning combination. And so often I see it, and my partners do it. There'll be a stump out there, and they'll just throw at it. They won't care about the wind. They don't care about the sun. They don't care about any kind of thing. They're just throwing at the target. But I'm not. I'm not throwing at that target. I'm analyzing the target first. Where's that fish going to be? Where he's most likely going to be. And I want to throw in front of him, in front of his face, and get that reflex action strike. It's so prevalent. So that's the second really big reason why bass bite. That's the most important reason, and I catch most of my fish on reflex action strikes. Now, let's talk about the third reason why they bite, anger. You know, anger, fish get mad. And I remember one time I was down in Santee Cooper, and I had a new Johnson spoon, and I would take the Johnson spoon and I'd throw in the weed beds, and I just work that thing over and over. I'd see the grass move a little bit, and like a carp would move, but it'd stop. I'd figure there's a bass in there. I'd throw it in there, and I'd see the grass move. Finally, after 20 or 30 casts sometimes, big old bass would grab the spoon. That happened quite often because you can make them mad. You anger them into a strike. And if you cast to the same spot time and time again, particularly a spawning fish or a fish that's up there in the shallow water, really is locked on an ambush point, you can catch them on an anger strike. That's so good. Now, we're talking about a protective instinct, and a protective instinct could be kind of the spawning instinct. And you know, so often the controversy is it ethical to catch fish when they're spawning? Well, in this case, I've talked to a lot of biologists. If we're doing a catch and release like we always do, it really doesn't hurt them that bad. It's just that when you keep the fish off a spawning bed, yeah, you'll hurt the fish. But as far as catching and releasing spawning fish, that seems to be all right. And it just have to be careful when you catch them. And if it's unethical, just don't go fishing in the month of April or May if you don't think that it's ethical to fish for spawning fish. Because no matter where you go, even if you don't know they're spawning, you go to any bank, there's probably a spawning fish there. So you're probably catching a spawning fish, even though you don't want to catch a spawning fish. You'll say to your friends, oh, I don't catch spawning fish. And yet you go April and May, throw up on the bank and catch a spawning fish. You don't even know it's a spawning fish. So the point is, if you catch and release spawning, I think you can catch spawning fish. That's my take on it. Okay, that was the first thing. Now, curiosity. You know, fish kind of group up together, and particularly in a school situation, and I'll talk about that again. Fish are curious. And I don't know if you've seen this, but I know one time I was up with one of my good friends up in Wisconsin, and we had the power poles down, and I put my little camera down the water just at the base of the power poles, and for some reason, and I saw a smallmouth, or actually a couple smallmouth. They were looking at the power pole, and it would drag along and make a little crunchy crunch in the rocks. And these 2 or 3 smallmouth were out here. I could see them with the camera. They were looking at that power pole. It would go, and I caught 2 or 3 smallmouth by dropping my little jig right by the power pole, and it would move a little bit, and they'd come and grab it because it was the curiosity. They were curious about that power pole just dragging on the bottom. They're curious about a Carolina rig when it just drags on the bottom and just drags and stops. They're curious about a plastic worm when it just kind of filters down and kind of falls there, just lays there. They're curious about it, maybe make a little twitch or two. They're curious about it. And so bass are quite curious, and that's a huge reason why they bite. And maybe 5% of the time you catch curious bass. Okay, we're getting there somewhere now. We've gone through about 5 or 6 ways they bite. Let's keep going. You know, there's another reason or two why they bite. I'm getting kind of down to the end of the thing right now. I've gotten through about 5 of them. Okay, curious. Now, competition. Now, let's talk about competition, because competition is when they're schooled up. Now that's really important because when you're out on a big river ledge and all of a sudden you make a cast with a Carolina rig and all of a sudden one just takes off with it, chances are there's a whole bunch of fish there. He's running with it real fast because he's trying to keep it away from the other fish. So what I do with competition involved, I'll catch 2 or 3 on that one color worm and then they kind of slack off it and I'll switch colors because again, the curiosity factor and also the fact that they're in competition with one another. I know that there's a school of fish there from the way they bite it, from the way they run when they bite it. You get that real fast action. So what I do is out of competition, I'll just remember to say that when you make a cast, with a plastic worm or a crankbait or anything, you get an instant strike. Just always think that there's a school of fish there. That's when I put my power pole down. That's when I hit my spot lock. That's when I always think that there's more than one fish there, particularly when you're fishing in open water. It works so much of the time. I've done a lot of shiner fishing lately at headwaters, and so often that first fish on the shiner will just be a harbinger of what's going to come. There's other fish are around, and they kind of keep coming in as I throw live bait out in the same spot. They're curious and they're in competition with one another, and they just keep coming in, and finally a whole school gets in there and they really get active and they really get in a frenzy, and now they're biting really, really good. So that's what you can see with shiners, but you can also do the same thing with the plastic worm. Well, there's a couple more reasons. There's a territorial instinct, and that's not a real big factor. It's just that there's certain fish like a certain dock, and they'll just stay right there no matter what. They just love that spot. They just won't ever leave it. You'll see that particular big fish on that same dock day after day after day after day. It's kind of just a territory that he's claimed for himself. It's usually the bigger fish that do that. The bigger fish take over a spot and chase the smaller fish away. So when you find a territory like that, a territorial bass is usually a great big one. Okay. Another reason, a killer instinct. I know this sounds crazy, but I've taken a Zara spook, and I know you guys have done the same thing. I've taken a big old giant Zara spook, that big, and I've thrown it out there, and I've gotten a bass maybe that even smaller than the plug. Now, what other instinct is there? Unless that fish is just such a killer that he's just wanting to attack something bigger than he is. I mean, it's just a killer instinct. And sometimes when they're really active, when they're really fired up and they're really in a frenzy, sometimes those even little fish will hit the most giant lures in the whole world. It doesn't always happen, but sometimes there's a killer instinct involved, and that could be a big part of it. Well, we're right down to the last reason, and it's so funny. Bass aren't very smart. And how you can tell they're not very smart is you can go into a wilderness lake. They bite out of ignorance somewhat. It's the last reason why they bite, but it's something. Have you ever been to Canada? Have you ever been to a virgin lake in the backwoods of Canada? You go in there, they haven't seen a fisherman in years. That fish is so ignorant and so dumb, and they haven't been caught out. In other words, in these lakes that are pressured a lot, these dumb ones get caught and eaten and taken out and die or whatever. It leaves the smart ones. The smart ones kind of survive. But in those Canadian lakes, they're all kind of stupid because they haven't seen anybody. And so they're just hit with wild abandon. But you go back the second day and you say, oh, they bit like crazy the first day. Some of them started to wise up, so the second day won't be quite as good as the first day. Well, we'll go back the third day. Third day is usually not as good as the second day. So the longer you fish a spot, the more you fish a spot, the smarter they get. So that's kind of the reasons why they bite. But the whole thing is set around the patterns that it takes to catch them. So remember to become a pattern fisherman, establish that pattern, get that exact set of water and cover conditions, tracking fish to that particular spot, and you'll catch fish. Hey, thanks for watching this video, and the Bass Pro Shop and all my people at Frog Togs, they'll really like it. Hit that likes button because that's the motor that keeps it all going, keeps the contracts going, keeps me in business. So we'll see you again soon. And hey, I hope I taught you a few things about how to establish a pattern and the reasons why bass bite.